Welcome to Facts Over Fuels with Isabella and Alex. Today, we're looking at electric cars. They're often presented as like the eco-friendly, future of transportation. But are they really all that green?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of hype.
Yeah.
But we dug through articles, reports, and studies, to try and get you the facts.
Yeah, and you can find links to all of that down in the description. So one of the first things that we noticed is that while electric cars, eliminate tailpipe emissions when you're driving, the manufacturing process is a whole other story.
Totally. The production of electric car batteries,
Under
especially those, have a really significant environmental impact. Like, did you know that mining the rare earth elements needed for these batteries can create 75 tons of acidic waste for every 1 ton of usable material?
75 to 1.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's a staggering amount of pollution that often gets overlooked.
So even before an electric car hits the road,
Yeah.
it's already got this huge environmental debt.
Exactly. And in addition to that, the energy used in battery production often comes from fossil fuels, which further contributes to their carbon footprint.
So zero emissions isn't really the full picture.
No, not at all. And it's also important to remember that when an electric car is on the road, the environmental impact is tied to where that electricity comes from. So if you're charging your EV in a place that's heavily reliant on coal power, those zero emissions quickly become significant CO2 emissions.
Location.
Yeah.
Applies to real estate and to electric cars. Sounds like we're uncovering some hidden costs here. What about hidden pollutants?
Well, we often focus on exhaust emissions, right?
Yeah.
But there are other sources of pollution that affect both electric and gasoline cars, like tires and brakes.
Tires.
Yeah.
I've heard of the microplastics from tires,
Yeah,
but I didn't realize they were such a major pollutant.
they are a big one. Tire wear generates these tiny particles, and a lot of those are microplastics that end up in our soil, our water, even the air. And because of their heavy battery packs, EVs are significantly heavier than gas-powered cars, which leads to faster tire wear and even more of those harmful particles.
Oh, wow. So even though they're cutting down on tailpipe emissions, EVs could actually be creating more pollution in other ways.
Yeah, it's a trade-off for sure.
What are the brakes?
So brakes release particulate matter as well, but EVs might actually have an advantage here because of regenerative braking.
Regenerative braking.
Yeah.
What is that?
Basically, it captures energy during braking and uses that to recharge the battery, which reduces wear on the brake pads.
Oh, so it's not all bad news. EVs might have the upper hand when it comes to brake dust.
Potentially. But more research is definitely needed to figure out the long-term effects of that regenerative braking.
It seems like every time we think we understand something, there's all this added complexity. We can't forget about the elephant in the room either. The battery. What happens to these batteries at the end of their life?
That is the question, and the answer is not very encouraging. Recycling lithium-ion batteries is a really complex and expensive process. Right now, only about 5% of them are actually recycled.
5%?
Yeah.
That's shockingly low. What happens to the other 95%?
Most of those end up in landfills, where they pose pretty significant environmental risks. They contain toxic materials that can leach into the soil and water and contaminate the environment.
It's kind of a paradox. These batteries are supposed to be the key to a greener future, but then they're creating this whole other wave of environmental problems.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Are there any efforts to improve this battery recycling situation?
There are definitely some companies and organizations working on developing new recycling technologies and building better infrastructure for battery recycling, but it's still pretty early.
Yeah.
We've got a long way to go.
This has been so eye-opening. We uncovered all these hidden costs associated with electric cars, costs that often get brushed aside in this rush to embrace this green solution. But there's still so much more to discuss. We need to zoom out and look at how electric vehicles fit into the bigger picture of transportation and climate change.
Exactly. We've only just scratched the surface here. There's a lot more to unpack.
In the last part, we really got into electric cars, like peeling back those layers of the green image to see what's really going on with manufacturing and battery production and those hidden pollutants like tire and brake dust. It's clear there's just a lot more to consider than tailpipe emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we look at the bigger picture, you start to see that just focusing on electric cars is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger wound.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, transportation sector, which includes all the cars and trucks and everything,
Yeah.
only makes up about 15% of global CO2 emissions. And within that, passenger cars, are just 7% of the total. So even if we magically replaced every gas car with a brand new electric car tomorrow, it wouldn't even come close to solving climate change.
That is sobering. So where are the other emissions coming from?
Other sectors like electricity generation, industry, and agriculture are much bigger sources of greenhouse gases. You've got power plants still running on fossil fuels, industrial processes that release tons of CO2, and agriculture, which contributes a lot to methane emissions.
So it's a much bigger problem than just what kind of car we drive.
Right. We can't just shift the problem from one place to another and pretend electric cars are the solution, while ignoring these massive emissions from other sectors.
So where do electric cars actually fit in? Are they still a part of the solution at all?
They can be, but we have to be realistic about their limitations. We talked about how the manufacturing and recycling still pose big environmental challenges, and those zero emissions only apply if the electricity comes from clean, renewable sources.
So the push for electric vehicles needs to go hand in hand with clean energy.
Exactly. It can't just be about swapping one car for another.
So what does a real solution look like? How do we create a truly sustainable transportation system?
Well, first we need to transition to a clean energy grid. That means investing in renewables like solar, wind, geothermal, and phasing out fossil fuels.
But how do we actually do that?
We need strong government policies
Yeah.
that encourage renewable energy development and stricter emissions regulations for power plants.
Well, it's not just about individual choices then.
Right. It requires big systemic changes.
This is where it gets interesting, because it's not just about technology and infrastructure. It's about changing how we think about transportation.
Absolutely. We're so used to this car-centric culture where everyone has to own a car. But there are more sustainable options.
Like what?
Well, there are car sharing programs
Right.
where people can rent a car only when they need it, and ride-hailing services that connect passengers with drivers.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about public transportation.
Oh, yeah.
Robust public transit systems are essential,
So it's about moving away from car ownership.
and embracing more collaborative approaches.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. We started with electric cars, and now we're talking about reimagining transportation. It's clear we can't just slap a green label on something and call it a day.
We need a much deeper transformation.
So where do we go from here?
That's what we'll talk about in part 3. We'll explore specific solutions, from new technologies to policy changes, that can lead to a truly sustainable transportation future.
So we've spent the last 2 parts really digging deep, haven't we, into electric cars.
Yeah, it's been a journey.
It's been fascinating to see just how much more there is to the story than we think.
It always is, right?
Yeah.
Especially with something like transportation, there's no easy answers.
So let's talk solutions. What can we actually do to move towards a truly sustainable transportation future? Where do we even begin?
Well, we've talked about the need for a cleaner energy grid. That's got to be the foundation until we decarbonize our electricity. Even the best electric cars are still going to be tied to a polluting energy source.
So more solar panels, wind farms, investment in renewables.
Exactly. And we also have to modernize the existing grid, make it smarter and more efficient so we can actually use all that renewable energy.
What about the batteries? We talked about the mining and the recycling challenges. Is there any hope there?
Well, one thing is to reduce our reliance on those rare earth elements. Researchers are looking at different battery chemistries that use more abundant materials.
So moving away from lithium-ion batteries completely.
Yeah, potentially.
What are some of the alternatives?
Solid-state batteries are showing a lot of promise. They could be safer and have higher energy density and might be easier to recycle. There's also research into sodium-ion batteries, which use sodium, which is much more common than lithium.
Okay, that's good to hear. But even with better batteries, we still have to figure out recycling.
Right. That's where the idea of a circular economy comes in. Designing batteries that are easy to disassemble and recycle so we can recover the materials and reuse them, instead of just creating more waste.
So it's not just about recycling. It's about designing things with the end in mind.
Yeah. And that thinking needs to apply to the whole manufacturing process.
Right.
Minimize waste at every stage.
So cleaner energy, sustainable batteries, circular economy. That's a great start. But it feels like there's still something missing.
You're right. We've focused on the technology, but we also need to think about how we use these vehicles.
Okay, how so?
Imagine a world with perfect electric cars. Clean energy, 100% recycling.
Sounds pretty good.
But if we're all still driving alone in our own cars,
No.
we're still going to have problems.
So even with better technology, we need to change our behavior.
Exactly. We have to move away from this idea that everyone needs to own a car.
So what are the alternatives?
We've talked about public transportation.
Yeah.
And then there's shared mobility.
Shared mobility.
Yeah, things like car sharing programs, ride-hailing services, even e-scooters and bikes.
So it's about having lots of options.
Exactly. The right tool for the right job.
And as technology gets better, we'll probably see even more options.
Like autonomous vehicles that can be shared.
Yeah, that's exciting. But all of this seems like a huge shift. Where do we even begin?
It starts with conversations like this, challenging assumptions, demanding better from our leaders and from ourselves.
It's a call to action for all of us.
It is.
This has been such an enlightening conversation. We started with electric cars, and we've ended up rethinking the whole system.
Yeah, it's all connected.
So to everyone listening, stay curious, stay engaged, and let's work together to create a transportation system that's truly sustainable.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.